Friends in Christ, Pastor Brian here. 60 years ago on August 28th, 1963, about 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial stirred the crowd and has inspired a nation ever since. I would commend to you the entirety of the text of that speech because it reminds us of the deep urgency of doing right by our neighbors now. An urgency that gets pushed into the future when we focus on "I have a dream." Dr. King, like the prophets we read in the Hebrew Scriptures, speaks directly to the failure of a people to live up to their ideals. The language Dr. King used was that of a promissory note, one written by the architects of our republic in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Dr. King states, "This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America, he said, has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. He goes on to paint a vivid portrait of the reality of black Americans of that era, encountering whites-only signs at restaurants, motels, public and governmental buildings, of being subjected to brutal police violence just for peaceful protest, or even for daring to register to vote. A portrait that we forget was not all that long ago. A portrait that has gotten better. But you can still see the reality beneath the surface in statistics like ones that show that black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to be shot and killed by police officers. The campaign that began that day was also not just about black Americans. The start of the day's program included calls for a national minimum wage to provide all Americans a decent standard of living, a training program to place all unemployed workers in jobs with decent wages so that all might pursue liberty, life, and happiness. Jesus and the prophets call us to attend to those on the fringes of society, the outcasts, the foreigners, the oppressed. God calls us to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless. God calls us to treat all human beings as those created in the image of God. Now, we have made progress towards fulfilling the promissory note, not only to black Americans, but all those who are poor in America. But let us remember that God calls us to be an outpost of the reign of God on earth today. Now, in this moment, even as we keep our sight on the dream that Dr. King shared that day. God's blessings.